And so I'm going to quickly touch on science, understanding that most of you know all of the science, or a good chunk of the science, but I just wanted to frame it up in terms of communication as well. And so in general, we're talking about climate change communication and best practices. You know, it's really important that we understand the basic mechanism of climate change, which is that layer of our atmosphere that traps in the Earth's heat. So as the sun's rays come into our planet, some of it gets reflected off of certain layers in our atmosphere, and most of it passes through to our planet, warms up our planet, and then as that heat comes out in a different wavelength, it can get kind of held in by this layer in our atmosphere, which is some folks refer to it as the greenhouse gases that trap the Earth's heat in, or you might hear it also referred to as a blanket-like effect. So that's just the basic mechanism of climate change. And then, of course, with this climate change, which it changes not only temperatures on our planet, but it changes other factors of climate like humidity and pieces like that. We're seeing a lot of long-term or indirect effects of that, which include things like sea level rise and extreme weather and ocean acidification and impacts to humans' health. So very quick overview. This is typically a 1-hour presentation on science that's compacted down into this maybe 5-minute overview. But sea level rise, one of the big things we really try to talk about is how even if you do not live on the coast or you do not live in an area impacted by rising seas, we are all impacted by sea level rise. This is a graph showing transportation, different types of transportation. The blue lines represent shipping lanes, and the reddish orange lines represent airplane travel. And then the kind of the greenish yellowish are roads. And you can see how much of our global, the way we transport goods and food and people rely on coastlines. And so, you know, a big part of our way of life relies on coastlines, at which sea level rise does impact. In terms of extreme weather, we're seeing more and more extreme weather events in our planet, and that, you know, that can translate in a bunch of different ways. One of the ways it can translate into is as a costly way in terms of billion-dollar disasters that take place. We're seeing more and more expensive events occur. And no matter where, again, no matter where you live, there's some form of extreme weather that impacts us. Even if it's the wildfires that occur on the West Coast, then we see air pollution associated with that on the East Coast. Another kind of overview of impact, of course, is not all the burning of fossil fuels goes into our atmosphere and acts as that heat trapping blanket. A portion of that is absorbed by our land, by our soil, by our trees, and then a portion of that is also absorbed by our oceans, which leads to ocean acidification. So it changes the chemistry of our oceans. It kind of shifts the balance of hydrogen ions in our ocean to make our oceans slightly more acidic. Our ocean is still basic, but this is causing our oceans to become more acidic, which is making it harder for animals especially animals with shells, to form their shells and get the ingredients they need out of the ocean. And then another big kind of piece to look at with climate change is the impacts of climate change events on human health. So from everything from as we experience more extreme weather like flooding, then we'll see impacts on water and food supplies, and we will see impacts on, you know, flooding could lead to malaria and other diseases related to that. We will see as temperatures change, we're seeing different migration patterns of animals in different zones. So Lyme disease and the range of Lyme disease is changing. So there's a lot of different impacts on human health as it relates to climate change. And then, of course, thinking about all of these in the context of climate justice, and that the folks that are probably at biggest risk or most heavily impacted by extreme weather, urban heat island effect. All of those things are often the folks with the fewest resources to deal with the impacts. So there's an extreme imbalance in the people impacted and the people prepared to deal with the impacts, and understanding that the solutions around climate change need to address these imbalances and inequalities. Okay, so that was a very quick climate science, and I'm sorry if I left you, there was some gaps there with the science. Again, I have a lot of resources I can go back on. But I do want to spend the majority of the time talking about communication techniques. These communication techniques were developed by Gnocchi, which was a grant funded by NSF started in 2012. Gnocchi stands for, unfortunately not the pasta, it stands for the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation. And it was a grant that pulled together aquariums. So we had 3 major aquariums, which have a large amount of audience of people coming, wanting to learn more about the ocean and the impacts on the ocean. It also pulled together the scientists from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, as well as the social scientists from Frameworks Institute, and then as well as evaluators, which is essential to any grant out there as well. So we've got social science, the scientists, and then the audience. And this partnership was set to kind of improve how we communicate climate change, understanding that really effective action around climate change means that we need to be talking about it more. In order to get to the solutions, we need to actually be talking about them in the first place. And recognizing with the 6 America studies through Yale that 2/3 of Americans think that climate change is happening now. So the majority of our population is concerned about climate change, and yet almost the same percentage talks about it rarely or never. Occasionally or never, sorry. And so there's a lot of social norming around, I don't talk about it, it's too political, and so I'm not going to bring it up because it's a sensitive conversation. I don't want to spoil this dinner, those kinds of things. And so because other people aren't bringing it up, you don't want to bring it up either, which leads to kind of a spiral of silence around climate change, which is not great when we want to talk about solutions and get to the solutions. So the more we can talk about it, the more we can equip people with the tools to talk about climate change, the more we can get to these solutions. So the big goal was helping spread around these great tools to give enough people some great techniques to help shift the overall conversation of climate change to be more productive, to be more creative, and to be focused on solutions. So Gnocchi, that grant, then developed all these tools and did a lot of trainings across the country. And then there's several different versions of this training. And this is the extreme short version of this training. But overall, the tools that were developed with the idea that we want to bridge the gap between scientists' understanding and public's understanding. So really connect to our audiences in a way that helps them understand the basic mechanism of climate change. So they don't need to understand 4 hours of climate science, they just need to understand the basic mechanism of climate change, which really helps them understand the solutions that will work for climate change. And then show them they can be plugged into the solutions, which ultimately leads them with a sense of hope. So really focusing on solutions, focusing on hope, and helping them understand climate change in a very basic way so that they can be inspired to be part of the solution. Okay, so where all of this kind of started was to help understand, we wanted to first take a step back and understand where people start out in their brains when it comes to general topics around climate science. And so in order to do that, we'll do a quick little activity here. I have this word here, and I apologize. This slide is, I keep meaning to change this. So when you see the word the ocean, what is an image that comes to mind? And it hopefully is different than the image that's on this slide when you see the word the ocean. And if you want to, does this, I don't know if Google Meet has chat very well. You can either unmute yourself and tell me kind of what you're seeing in your head, or you can pop it in chat if that exists.
Yes, we definitely have chat.
Okay, great. So if you want to just pop into chat a couple of words to describe what you're seeing in your head when it comes to the word the ocean.
Oh, not what we're seeing on the screen, but what actually.
Not what you're saying, right? Your own mental image.
This is like writing the word yellow in black.
I know, I really, yes, I apologize for the background. That was not intended. So what's your mental image? What pops up in your head when you see that word? Vastness. Okay, great. Huge crashing waves. Vulnerable. Anyone else? Endless horizon. Dark navy ocean with white crests. Excellent. Okay, so keeping that in mind, when you Google the word the ocean, oh, now I clicked on chat, so my thing is not, oh, there we go. When you Google the word the ocean, those are the top 25 images that pop up. And you might notice, or you might kind of recognize some of the mental process you had was similar to some of these images. And that is not by accident. And that's because for our brains, we have what's known as cultural models, or kind of shortcuts in our brains. If we every single day had to process the word the ocean for the first time ever, it would take us forever to get through our day, because we would have to think about, recall all the times we spent with the ocean, kind of summarize it for ourselves. But instead, our brain develops shortcuts around big concepts like the ocean. And those shortcuts are often developed through our lived experiences. So as a kid, you might have visited the ocean, you might have seen some movies around the ocean, maybe Moana a couple times, different ways to understand the ocean in your own brain. And that leads to these mental shortcuts when you see the word the ocean. And that exists for all of us, and there are some commonalities with these shortcuts. So this is another way to think about it. This is your brain here. And at first, when you're young, anytime you hear a large concept, you have to kind of take the long road, or you have to kind of forge your way through a field, and you're kind of trying to understand it a little better. But over time, you build up your understanding more and more and more till you take a pretty quick shortcut. When you hear large concepts like ocean or climate change or science, your brain kind of jumps to some conclusions. One of my favorite stories is that when walking to the aquarium one day, there was a small child looking at a storm drain and kind of looking straight down and like just kind of pondering it and just kind of blown away by this storm drain. And it was this child kind of experiencing the storm drain for the first time and wondering what it, why it exists and what's going through it and what, all those kind of things. Whereas adults, when we see a storm drain, we don't even think about it too much. Our brains kind of take it for granted that we have a shortcut of what it's doing and why it's there, and we just keep on moving with our day. But as kids, they have to build up those pathways. So what Frameworks did is they did one-on-one interviews. These sound very interesting. 3-hour-long interviews with 3,000 people, representing folks from all different, a wide range of participants, all different walks of life from all over around the country. Really open-ended questions around large concepts like ocean, and then identified those common shortcuts or those cultural models, those shared cultural models with our audiences. And with everything, we have several different cultural models, right? So there's not just one for every single large topic. Things like the ocean is vast, which I think Astrid nicely pointed out. Vastness is a shared cultural model with oceans. Another shared cultural model is that oceans support humans. And while there's nothing wrong with having all of these cultural models in our head, and that's a very natural thing, you can see with climate change, when we're talking about solutions, that some of these are more helpful in our conversations than others. So talking about how the ocean is vast, it's a very true piece of information, but it's a lot harder to get to solutions and feel like you can plug into the problem if you focus on how vast the ocean is. You can see that a lot with plastic pollution and people not being too concerned about it because the ocean is just so large. And what's one straw? So being aware of the culture models, being aware of which ones will really help get your message advanced towards a positivity and solution. Now, this is what we call the swamp, which is the collection of all of those cultural models based around all the testing. And I apologize that I hope no one here is colorblind. I do have a better image I need to upload next time, which allows for folks that are colorblind to see this a little bit better. But the green is the cultural models in each category that are the better ones to advance in terms of thinking about your conversation and staying solution focused. The pea green ones, or the kind of the yellowish ones, those are not terrible. They're not as good. And then the red ones can kind of get you kind of stuck in the swamp a little bit in terms of if the person or the conversation stirs up that cultural model, it's going to be a little bit harder to get to your solutions. With all of this, one, it takes a long time to learn these and recognize them for what they are. And then it takes another piece of time to identify them when you're having a conversation and then steer the conversation back to a green area of the swamp. And I'll show you kind of a trick to do that. But with all of these things, all those tools that I'll show you, these are very much like a weak, flabby muscle that we all have. The more and more and more you practice recognizing these and using them in a productive way, the more you're strengthening that muscle, to the point where you can get in a conversation and you'll find yourself naturally, mentioning a lot that oceans support humans and things like that, because you understand that is triggering a good area, a good cultural model to focus on. So this is a really great resource. And again, I'll share this as well, but it's a really great resource to keep in mind when you're talking about all these large concepts. And not just to climate change, of course, these are cultural models, oceans, when we're thinking about plastic pollution, they're helpful for those issues as well. Are there any questions, by the way? I meant to mention that you're welcome to always put questions in chat or pop in with them as well. This is one slide that kind of I throw in here because they did additional research, Frameworks did additional research in 2016 and 2017 when it was clear how political climate change was getting. And they wanted to better understand just more recommended terminology to avoid closing a door unnecessarily in a conversation. So with some of these and where some people work, this is a little bit harder than others. But here at the aquarium, we do try to use words like civic leaders and approaches and programs over terms like politicians, policies, and laws, because the moment we use those other words, there might be someone in the audience that turns off because they're not interested in it becoming a political conversation. So helping to keep in mind that sometimes even the words you use can help keep the conversation more open is helpful piece of information. Bridge and pivot is the technique that a lot of people use, and you might use this already, but it's a technique that really helps you get out of the bad area of a conversation and into a better one. So for example, if someone has triggered a bad area of the swamp and you want to pivot into a better area of the swamp, or if the conversation, if you have a group of 20 folks and there's one person in that group that is a very loud climate denier, and you want to spend your time and effort on the other 19 people getting towards climate solutions, then bridge and pivot is a really great tool for that. So it is a public relations technique. It really helps recognize the person without giving any more weight to what they are adding to the conversation, and it helps you pivot into a better area of the conversation. The kind of mental steps that you do when you bridge and pivot are: one, just be aware, kind of have that awareness that you are not in an area of the conversation that you would like to be. So that analyze of, hey, wait a minute, this is not productive, this is not going to help us get towards solutions, or hey, I recognize this is a bad area of the swamp. That analysis piece is step one. Step two is you saying a bridging statement, which is a phrase I'll show you in a second. And then step three is you pivoting, or after saying the bridging statement, getting to the good area of the swamp. And some of the bridging statements are things like, what's most important to understand? The key here is, a question I get asked a lot is, another way to look at this is, while weather is important, it's also important to remember, or let me emphasize again. So these are just very generic statements, and I find that I usually pick my favorite of, like, the key here is one I use fairly often. So if there's someone that, you know, mentions, well, what's one straw in the ocean going to do? The key here is that ocean life supports all humans, and we all need to be taking action together to make an impact. So identifying the bad area of the swamp, bridging statement, and then getting over to that good area. Before I move on, any questions about that? Okay. All right, here are some more tools. This is our kind of the rest of the toolkit. Thinking about the tone you use in your conversation, thinking about using values to help connect people to what really matters to them, using explanatory chains and metaphors to help make big concepts much more understandable and sticky to your audiences, and then of course solutions, which don't use this presentation as a good example of the balance of solutions to other things in your conversation. So in general here at the aquarium, we like to get through all the meat of what climate change is, and even the impacts, in 60 seconds or less. And then the conversation is about solutions, really. That's the meat of our conversations. This one is tough. So a tone is not even just how you say things. It can be how you write things as well. And IPCC report and things like those do have that the sky is falling crisis tone to them. And can anyone guess why that is not the most effective tone to use with audiences around climate change? You can put it in the chat or speak out. Yeah. Yep. I actually love all of these comments. So people don't like Chicken Little. It scares people away. That inevitable fate. It's too dramatic for some. People throw their hands in the air, nothing to do. And then it's too late for solutions. I think, right, the whole sky is falling. You know, if we're on our 6th IPCC report about sky is falling and the sky hasn't actually fallen, then it's a little bit. I understand. Right, IPCC, yeah. So you want to not scare people away. So you don't want to invoke that fight, flight, or freeze response. You want people to be able to digest the information and still have some hope at the end of the conversation. Yeah, all your comments are right on. So I think it's hard because I think a lot of times as communicators, if you do present something big and scary, like some of the slides I presented earlier around the science of, billion-dollar disasters and it affecting us all, those kinds of things, you do get a strong response from your audience of, oh my, and as a communicator, you're like, I did it. I connected to them. You check, I got that. However, if we're thinking about long-term behavior change, that's not the response. That doesn't a shock and awe response is not indicative of long-term behavior change. So it's hard to constantly, for me, to understand that you can still be urgent, you can still say this is an urgent matter, and that we need to do things today, but we can address it in a neutral or explanatory tone instead of an urgent, instead of a crisis tone. Response is different from reaction, right? People react, but respond is more, right? So action over, yeah. Okay, so besides tone, thinking about values and using values in communication is really helpful because sometimes, especially with large audiences, you don't have time to connect to everyone's individual story for why climate change matters to them. You need to broadly communicate to folks, and there are some broadly held values that we all connect with. And so establishing early in the conversation that I care about climate change and we both care about climate change because of these same commonly held values helps help people buy into the conversation or be more connected, strongly connected, emotionally connected to the conversation. The two values, this frameworks did test a whole host of values. The two that tested the strongest in terms of getting people to productively and be engaged were protection and responsible management. And these do not have to be used only one at a time. You can absolutely use both of these values in your communication at the same time. But knowing if you cue the value of protection or the value of the responsible management kind of early and often in a conversation, it will much more strongly connect the audience that you're talking to with what you're talking about. So here's an example of one of the values in a communication, or maybe the kind of the opening line of something you might hear an educator at the aquarium say. We believe in protecting and preserving the world's unique habitats, like the river forest you see here. By taking action now to ensure this habitat will be here for the animals that live in it, we are also protecting future generations from the increased storms and floods we can expect to experience due to the changing climate. So you'll see in this, there are a lot of, you can see the word protect. You don't have to be discreet about using these values. We've got protecting and preserving. We've got taking action, which is kind of the responsible management cue, protecting future generations. So putting it in a couple of times right in the beginning really help hook your audience into what matters to them. Explanatory metaphors and chains. So these are both just tools and pretty much in any conversation situation that really help explain larger concepts in a much easier to digest way. And we all use metaphors throughout our communication to do that. The metaphors that frameworks did test, again, a bunch of metaphors and figured out which ones were the most effective at getting people to understand the basic mechanism of climate change in a way that helps them think productively around solutions. So I'll show you the ones that they came up with that. But the other one that I wanted to mention is explanatory chains, and that's just a technique to make sure that you are not leaving a cognitive gap. So if you're explaining something, and I am very worried that when I was explaining the science, I left several cognitive gaps because I jumped very quickly from point A to point D to point F, instead of making sure I was kind of going in order. So any explanatory chain, just make sure that you don't leave a spot missing in the chain of explanation that you have. If you do have one chain link missing, your audience will get stuck there and you will still be talking and they will still be thinking about or be confused about that one spot that you left out. So an explanatory chain is more than just missing that one piece of information. It's leaving your audience behind in that gap because they can't get past that one piece of information. So one good tip that I like to say if you're developing a script or any sort of communication, that's especially really complicated in terms of science and things like that, is to start your next sentence with a little bit of the end of the last sentence. So if, as we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, we're adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, period. As we add this carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it's building up and acting like a heat trapping blanket, period. This heat trapping blanket, so being very obvious with starting the next sentence with the ending of your last sentence, helps you chain link your ideas together and make sure you're not leaving anything behind. Heat trapping blanket, that was the best tested metaphor around explaining the basic mechanism of climate change. And this is kind of our 60-second or less or elevator pitch around climate change. As we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and I actually like to say gas because it's not very, even though it's somewhat everything's natural, it's actually methane gas. But gas is probably the best term to use. As we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas in order to power our lives, we are emitting excessive carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And this excessive carbon dioxide is building up around our globe, acting like a heat-trapping blanket, retaining heat that should otherwise be escaping. As we retain heat, you'll notice the chain there, the air and the ocean temperatures increase, leading to sea level rise, more extreme storms, and disruptions in our climate. The good news is because this starts with our decisions on how we power our lives, there are many actions we can take individually and as communities to have a positive impact. So starting with the issue, which is the burning of fossil fuels, getting to the heat trapping blanket, which helps explain the basic mechanism of climate change, connecting that to what we're seeing on our planet and why that is disruptive to our planet, and then ending up with solutions is kind of the order that's recommended. And then, of course, as we get to solutions, there are many different ways and categories. You can look at the solutions of climate change. One is shifting our energy, so moving away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. Another category is being more efficient, so using less energy overall, which is everything from more double paned glass and more insulation in your homes and things like that. And then talking about it, raising that volume, raising that awareness, talking about solutions more is absolutely a part of the solution to climate change. Another thing to keep in mind with solutions is that they have to match the scale of the problem. The one caveat to that is that it depends on the age. So if you're talking to really young kids, you're not going to tell them to vote, or there are, you're not going to tell them to do a community level project to a 4-year-old. So you do have to match the solutions a little bit to the age. So for a 4-year-old, turning off their lights is probably a good step. However, for everyone ages, 10 and up, turning off your lights doesn't really match the scale of the problem. It doesn't feel authentic or appropriate. Solutions in general activate the we. It's not you should be doing this, it's we should be doing this, or we can be doing this, or we're doing this already, or you can join us, that kind of thing. In general, the best solutions are at the regional level. So state, communities, which communities could be much bigger than region, but federal is a little bit large, but there are some great solutions at the federal level as well. But in general, state level or county, all those kinds of things are really great levels of solutions. And then the more you can talk about solutions, the more you're adding that inspiration and hope to the conversation, which will drive action. I got to, of course, mention at the National Aquarium, we do have, I don't know how much Laura Banky has mentioned it, but we do have a conservation action plan. And one of the 3 main goals is to combat climate change. And within that goal, we are combating climate change through kind of 3 different areas of thinking about how we can protect and restore the environment, caring and advocating for animals, both in our care and out in our oceans, and then educating and empowering people to both understand what's going on, shift the conversation, and be part of the solution. Okay, I think I did that in record time. That's all I have, but I would be happy to open it up to any questions or thoughts around all of this. Yeah.
Megan, that's a wonderful presentation. Thanks for showing us that. Can you share any of your personal experiences with how you've used some of these techniques and what kinds of groups you've been speaking to, and how these techniques have helped you get around some of the social pitfalls?
Sure. I think more and more I've been using bridge and pivot. I think, especially as it's an increasingly political conversation. I've found myself needing to help pull people out of an unproductive area of the conversation and get back onto solutions. And so I think bridge and pivot is probably one of my favorite aspects of all of this training, because of how incredibly helpful it's been, especially in the current climate. I don't spend too much time anymore on the floor myself of the aquarium talking to guests, but when I did, one, I was always shocked at how few deniers there actually are. I think they're loud in other places, and so you're always scared to go out there and kind of, you feel like you're about to get jumped on by climate denier wolves or something. That doesn't really happen, and most of the time people are very appreciative that you started that conversation. Just like you go to the gym and you're really happy that you just forced yourself to go to the gym because you feel great afterwards. It's kind of that situation with climate change. But most of the time now I spend, I'm involved with the gnocchi community, which it's no longer an active grant, but it now is a community. And we do coursework and there, but then at the aquarium, lots of internal culture training around climate change communication, as well as I've shared various versions of this training with other groups, and especially around the region. So that's what I spend most of my time on right now. And I think I do really love how much I've seen a positive solution focused approaches increase in communications. Of course, I still see lots of crisis and doom and gloom, but I've been pretty hopeful at kind of some of the articles I've seen lately. I don't know if that's because that's what people share with me or not. Maybe it's a biased view, but and I don't know if I just got off track with your question. So feel free.
No, I appreciate you sharing those experiences. It sounds like you have real life evidence that these techniques work.
Megan, thank you. That was really good. I really appreciate it. I have a question about if you've ever maybe had to incorporate another strategy when you are left with nowhere else to turn, maybe. And that strategy is to focus on the economic opportunities for jobs as we simultaneously tackle climate change and the energy transition. In other words, like when I'm desperate to find something to pivot to, as a state with a provision in our law that says we have to simultaneously tackle climate change and have a positive impact on the economy and create jobs. John Kuhn can certainly speak to this because he championed it. That's, I mean, I didn't hear you mention that piece in your talk, and I wonder if it's something that you just avoided, or have you ever had to use that strategy?
So you're talking about the financial benefit of shifting towards renewable energy? Is that what you're saying?
In general, in tackling climate change, and you quickly pivot, you can I forget the term you use, the link to. So we're tackling this climate crisis, but it can have a positive impact on the economy and create jobs for people. So it's sort of like it doesn't always, fighting climate change, will be expensive, but depending on which way you come at that hurdle. I mean, as a policy writer, it's got the cost of this is the biggest hurdle. So
right.
It's not. I mean, behavioral stuff is obviously challenging, but I'm facing like the cost as we write the plan. So if we can framing that in terms of like, yes, it's going to cost, but there's also economic opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I think so. It wasn't extreme intentionality to avoid it. However, and I was about to share the swamp image again. There are a lot of sticky areas once you involve cost and money into the conversation, like the coal, taking away their jobs and all those kinds of pieces. So I think at the aquarium we don't get into that area as much because it's easier for us to stay in some other other areas. But depending on where you work and your audiences, it's much harder to avoid that part of the conversation. And I think, thinking about the Americans are problem solvers, and humans, like those positive areas of the swamp of like it's human caused. Ecosystems are valuable resources, but maybe not monetarily valuable, but just ecosystems are valuable, and it's up to us to problem solve, and I would probably try to stay above a little bit.
Understood.
Chris, where I work at Chesapeake Conservancy, we often bridge and pivot to what you were just explaining, especially to the outdoor recreation economy, which is a real key point we share a bit. Megan, that was incredible. And I just wanted to remark about something that when you were talking about chain links and bridging and pivoting, you took me right back to graduate school. And I remember the professor gave us a semester-long project. We had to watch Meet the Press every single Sunday and count how many times we heard the bridges. And absolutely the key here was the most frequent one. And I wrote my, end of term paper about that. And I challenge, and this goes back to when Tim Russert was the host, but I challenge everybody on this call, if you play this game, I bet it's still the key here it is just enormously impactful. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Megan, that was incredible. And I know you really met that challenge of giving a presentation in a very short amount of time. And I know that this presentation can be, a day-long event, or even, half a day or a day-long event. Are there opportunities for our members and guests here today to attend a deeper training?
So yes, there is what's known as a crash course, which is ironic because the crash course is actually an 8-week long event. So that's the shortened version for gnocchi, because the version I went through was kind of like a semester long course. So the crash course is an 8-week long course where once a week you do an hour webinar with about 2 hours of homework in between, kind of practicing the skill sets and learning more about things. And that is, it's offered about twice a year through Gnocchi. And I believe there's one starting a week from tomorrow. So that's a good opportunity. And there are even, so I know the crash course costs $250 to participate, but there are scholarship opportunities too if there are people who are not able to afford it. That's probably the most easily available one that I know of, but there are sometimes opportunities for other engagements. They just don't come up routinely like crash course does.
Great, thank you. Any other questions today for Megan while we have her?
Megan, I have one question. When you put up your solution slide, I mean, you were focused a lot on mitigation. Did you intentionally not focus on adaptation strategies?
Do you mean the key solution slide, the energy shift, the energy efficiency one?
Yeah.
I think keys, no, that was more in terms of how we talk about it with, I should have said, how we talk about the aquarium with our audiences.
Okay.
So we're focused more with our audiences talking about how they their energy and be more energy efficient and talk about it, as opposed to, suggesting how they can, like we do still talk about, rain gardens and other things like that, but it's not as big of a category.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Megan. I feel like we could have you back again.